there's no doubt that the doctrines of warfare were indeed, as Dr. Peterson points out, formulated several centuries after Muhammad's death, and that they were formulated during an imperial period. There's also no doubt that they've never been reformed or rejected, and that the apparatus to do so does exist. There are still these schools of jurisprudence operating, and not one of them has ever said, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't wage war against unbelievers in order to establish the hegemony of Islamic law against them. They had a golden opportunity to do this, as a matter of fact, after 9/11, when there were people who were pointing out that these doctrines existed. Then was the time when the New York Times went to Al-Azhar University in Cairo and said it was a beacon of moderation, trying to teach Muslims that warfare was not the way to go. And Al-Azhar University in Cairo has given its endorsement to a manual of Islamic law that says very clearly that the Muslim community must wage war against Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they either become Muslim or pay the non-Muslim poll tax, the jizya, that we both mentioned. Now, they could have rescinded their endorsement of such ideas at that time. They could have backed up the New York Times wishful thinking and shown themselves in some way to be moderate. They did not do so. And there still continues to be no major Islamic authority that has done so. And so what I am doing in my work is not trying to make the case any better or worse than it is. And I invite any fair-minded person to look at the books that I've written. I never actually say, contrary to Dr. Peterson's claim, that the jihadist version of Islam is the true Islam. There is no central authority in Islam. There's no Islamic pope. And there is no person who can pronounce and say, this is real Islam and this isn't. But there's no doubt that the jihadists are using the claim that they represent the true Islam and are buttressing that claim by reference to these traditional elements of Islam to gain recruits around the Islamic world. Until we recognize that and challenge it, rather than try to wish it away, it will continue.
Dr. Peterson, you've mentioned on several occasions that this may just be a misunderstanding between the Western world and non-Muslims and Muslims. How do you contend that we should deal with the threat of terrorism in places, not just inside countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, but where it's been exported abroad? We've seen it in England, France, of course in the United States. How do you explain the phenomenon of terrorism? How should the United States or even Western nations respond to that threat?
Well, I don't see it as a misunderstanding between Muslims and non-Muslims. I see it as, there really is. I mean, in a sense, we are really not disagreeing that much, except I do object to the idea that I'm making up pretty things in the Quran, playing games, wishing it away. I'm not. I have a pretty cold, realistic view of the Islamic world. Terrorism, Islamic terrorism, really does have roots in actual parts of the tradition of Islam. I'm simply arguing there are people out there, no major schools yet, and no authorities. There is no Islamic pope to, for example, to issue some sort of encyclical denouncing terrorism. Nobody has that kind of authority. But there are voices out there, and some pretty prominent ones, who have come out, even some pretty anti-American sheikhs in Saudi Arabia, were critical of the 9/11 attacks, for example. Not as critical as I would like them to be, but they were critical of those attacks because of their assault on civilians and so on and so forth, and their failure to discriminate between military combatants and others. How would I like to see us respond? I think that there's, I've said already that I'm a supporter of the surge and I'm a supporter of the war in Afghanistan. I think a major military response is necessary in some areas. I think we ought also to be fighting the war of ideas in various ways, which we're not doing. At one point, I was told that the U.S. was actually cutting back on broadcasting of idea programs into the Middle East and was broadcasting American popular culture. For example, and I'm not making this up, Britney Spears.
That's true.
Now, I can't imagine a stupider policy than that, to reinforce all the Islamist stereotypes about the West. That's the kind of thing we've been doing. But there are elements, there are little tiny elements out there in this very dysfunctional period of Islamic history, little embers out there that I'd like to see us blow upon if we can, to fan them into life. I don't know how we can do that. This is a very difficult question. Because if these people are seen as somehow CIA supported or something like that, that's the kiss of death to them. But we ought to be encouraging, hoping for, doing everything we can to sort of support the mainstream, or support, the moderate reinterpretation of these elements in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition, and to reinforce those peaceful elements, which I insist I am not making up. They are there. They're legitimate interpretations. Thank you very much. They're legitimate interpretations. I know I'm going to lose this debate, but it doesn't matter. Think of me as a martyr. Thanks.
Don't do that.
Hold on.